Hello, hello. Today's menu, prop balancing. Okay, so some fellas are having trouble balancing a 3-blade prop. I don't know why, because I found it easier to balance a 3-blade prop rather than the 2-blade prop, and that is because I don't balance the hub on the 2-blade props. So, well, easier, I mean, I can balance it more precise. Of course, there's a lot more work involved in a two-bladed prop. So that's my DIY prop balancer, 2 magnets, Y fork, level, just for a tiny bit more precision. So before I put the prop on the balancer, I ream the holes using a reamer. I don't use a drill because you can lose a tiny bit off, and I enlarge the hole exactly to the diameter before I balance the prop. Because if you do it after, if you're gonna miss a tiny bit, all the balance will be off. So here's the version which way I do it. Okay, right. As long as this prop is only a little bit, that tiny bit of a friction one side of a magnet still affects it. So I'm just tapping, and it find its own way, its own place. So what I'm doing now is I'm gonna find the blades by the weight. That's my at the bottom. So this is my heaviest blade. I'm gonna mark it with a pencil. 1, 2, 3. Okay, this one goes down a bit more. That's my second heaviest. That will be number 2, and that will be number 1. I don't use tape. I sand on the inside of a prop. So I'm starting from the second heaviest because the lightest you don't need to balance the lightest. Well, only a little bit, just for fine tweaking. You don't need to sand this one. So I'm starting from the second heaviest, and what I'm doing, I am bringing it the lightest and the second heaviest up to the same point, up to the same weight of a blades. So my number 2, of course, is heavier than number 1. Have to sand, get the number 2 done. Okay, so my number 2 now is matching with my number 1 blade. When I'm putting on like this, it's all level here. And to double check for precise, because the number 3 is the heaviest, to double check, I'm putting the number 3 on the very top, and then looking where it's going. If it's going that way, where's my number 2? That means number 2 still slightly a bit heavier. If it's going back, then I have to, that means I sanded too much and I have to go back on the number 1. Right, so my number 1 and my number 2 are matching now in the weight. So from the pivot point, all the radius it has to be all balanced, whichever way you're gonna put the prop. Now, as long as my number one and number 2 are matching, I'm putting the number 3 blade horizontally, and here's where the physics kicks in. 2 blades, of course, heavier than 1 blade, but 2 blades closer to the pivot point should be exactly same weight as 1 blade further away from the pivot point. That's your bloody seesaw when you were a little kid and you were light and some fat fecker wanted to have a swing with you. Okay, so my number 3 has to match this weight. As you can see, that was my heaviest blade, and this will be the most sanding involved into number 3. Okay, let's get it done. Okay, now as you can see, I sanded a bit too much for the number 3. It's now bloody lighter than number 1 and number 2. A bit overkill. So what I'm gonna do, I'm get the number 1 and number 2 again to match number 3. Damn it, a bit too much. Hold on. So what I did is I sanded the number 3 a bit too much, so I just got counted the strokes on number 1 and number 2 to make sure they're still matching there. So what I was doing here, I was sanding it with a rougher grid sandpaper, and I left fine tuning for the smooth grid sandpaper. And the last thing is left to double check. So here's my 1, putting on horizontally, checking what's it like in relation to number 2 and number 3. Yeah, looks good enough. My number 2 horizontally looks good enough. There's my number 3. Tiny bit heavier, still good enough for me. No need to do anything. Right, so bye bye.